The world stopped for a moment. Outside a dusty roadside diner in Arizona, a little girl ran barefoot down the highway, her face streaked with tears and dust. She wasn't just crying. She was pleading for someone to listen. "Please," she screamed, her tiny voice cracking under the weight of fear. "They're hurting my mama." Inside the diner, the clatter of silverware froze mid-air, and conversations fell silent. People turned, confused, unsure if what they were hearing was real. At the far end of the diner, a man named Mason Cole looked up from his half-empty coffee cup. A quiet biker with a scar along his jaw, he had seen more than his share of pain. But something about that child's cry hit a nerve deep inside him. He pushed back his chair, the wooden legs scraping against the floor, and for a split second, their eyes met. The kind of look that burns into your memory forever. None of them knew it yet, but what would happen next would change lives forever. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Who was hurting her mother, and why was she running to them? The town of Dry Creek sat on the edge of nowhere, a stretch of cracked asphalt, faded gas signs, and memories people tried to forget. The diner, Rosie's, was the kind of place where the smell of burnt coffee and fried bacon lingered in the air like the ghosts of conversations long gone. Mason Cole had stopped there with a few riders from his group, men who shared the same silence, the same tired eyes. They came here every few weeks, not for the food, but for the quiet. Mason liked that about this place. Nobody asked questions. Nobody cared who you used to be. Before that morning, Mason had spent years trying to outrun the man he once was. A man with bruised knuckles, bad decisions, and a past filled with things he never talked about. He had seen what happens when people look the other way, when help never comes. So, when he saw that little girl running down the road, it wasn't just shock that hit him, it was recognition. He knew that kind of fear, the kind that comes when you realize no one's coming to save you. She couldn't have been more than 7, barefoot. Her knees scraped raw. A torn floral dress hung loosely from her shoulders, and in her arms, she clutched what was left of a teddy bear, one button eye missing, the other dangling by a thread. The way she held it wasn't just out of comfort, it was protection, a child's last defense against a world that had already shown her its cruelty. She stumbled toward the group of bikers, gasping for air, eyes wide with desperation. "Please, help my mama," she whispered. And for a long second, nobody moved. But she didn't run to the sheriff's office, or a nearby house, or even the diner full of families. She ran to the only people she thought might listen, strangers on bikes, men who looked like trouble but, to her, maybe looked like hope. And as Mason knelt to meet her eye level, the faint sound of wind over the desert filled the silence. The girl tugged his sleeve, pointing down a dirt road that cut through the horizon like a scar. "They took her there," she said, trembling. Mason looked up, following her gaze. The others exchanged wary glances, unsure what to do. But Mason already knew. Something in his gut told him this wasn't just some family argument gone wrong. There was more. Something waiting beyond that stretch of road, something that would test every part of who he was. He stood, dusted off his jacket, and said quietly, "Show me." But what waited at the end of that dirt road was far worse than anyone could imagine. The engines rumbled like thunder against the empty desert. Heat shimmered above the dirt road, turning the horizon into a wavering blur. Dust rose in clouds behind them as Mason and the other riders followed the little girl, who ran ahead, her small frame cutting through the light like a fragile shadow. The wind carried nothing but the low hum of their bikes and the sound of her hurried breaths. For miles, no one spoke. Every man in that group could feel it, that uneasy pull in the gut when something doesn't sit right. One of the bikers, Vince, finally broke the silence. "You sure about this, Mason? Could be some setup. Ain't our business anyway." Another, younger and more restless, muttered, "Kid looks scared out of her mind, man. Maybe we should just call it in." but Mason said nothing. His eyes stayed on the road, his hands gripping the handlebars tighter. He'd been down too many roads like this, roads that started with a cry for help and ended with regret. He didn't trust many things anymore, but he trusted that feeling in his chest that told him he couldn't turn away this time. The dirt road wound past dead mesquite trees and rusted fence posts, until finally the girl slowed down and pointed. "There," she whispered. Ahead stood a small trailer, half collapsed, its windows shattered, the metal sides sun-bleached and scarred. An old pickup sat in the yard, one tire flat, the other half buried in sand. The front door hung slightly open, swaying in the breeze like it was breathing. They didn't know what they were walking into. As the engines cut off, silence swallowed the air. Then came the sound. Faint at first, like the wind caught in a can, but then clearer. A muffled scream, the kind that crawls under your skin and stays there. The little girl froze, clutching her teddy bear so tight Mason could see her knuckles whiten. "That's her," she whispered. Mason's pulse quickened. He had been here before. Not this house, but this moment. The waiting. The knowing something awful was on the other side of that door. He motioned for the others to stay quiet. The group moved closer, their boots crunching softly against gravel. The smell of stale beer and gasoline hung in the air. Inside, a man's voice shouted, slurred words, angry and wild. "You don't tell me what to do in my house." Then a crash. Mason edged toward a cracked window, peering through the grime-streaked glass. What he saw made his blood run cold. A man stood over a woman, rage twisted across his face. The girl's mother, bruised and trembling, shielded her face with her arms. On the table beside him sat an open bottle of whiskey and a revolver. Mason exhaled slowly. The man inside, her stepfather, was drunk, violent, and armed. For a moment, everything was still. Then the floor inside creaked, followed by the faintest sound of sobbing. Mason turned to the others, his jaw tightening. "Stay back," he said. But before he could move, the door creaked open on its own, a long, aching sound that cut through the silence like a warning. They didn't know what was waiting for them inside that house. And then, the door creaked wider. The girl's eyes filled with tears, and Mason took a single step forward, knowing this was the moment that would either save her family or destroy what was left of his own soul. But the man inside wasn't alone. The desert air had gone still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Mason crouched low behind an old rusted truck while the others spread out, each man moving with the uneasy understanding that things could go bad fast. No one needed to say a word. They all knew what they were walking into. Vince nodded toward the front porch, where a loose screen door rattled against its frame. "I'll go around, make some noise. You take the back," he muttered. Mason gave a single nod, eyes locked on the thin line of light spilling from a crack in the doorway. Behind him, the little girl stood trembling. She grabbed Mason's jacket, her voice barely a whisper. "Please save her." The words hit harder than any punch he'd ever taken. He placed a hand on her shoulder, steady but quiet, and said, "Stay here. Don't move till I tell you." Each step toward the back door felt heavier. His boots pressed against the dry sand, every crunch echoing in his head like thunder. The house creaked with the weight of secrets. Mason's breath grew shallow as he reached for the door handle. Inside, voices collided, anger, fear, slurred shouting. "You think you can just run off?" a man yelled. "You're mine! You hear me?" A loud thud followed, then a soft moan. Mason's pulse quickened. He turned the knob slowly. The hinges groaned. The smell of whiskey, sweat, and gun oil hit him all at once. The room was dimly lit, just one lamp flickering in the corner. The mother sat tied to a chair, her lip split, blood tracing the edge of her chin. Her wrists were raw against the rope. Across from her stood a man, heavy-set, glassy-eyed, veins pulsing in his neck. In his right hand, he held a revolver. "You think someone's coming for you?" he sneered. But what caught Mason's attention wasn't him. It was the shadow moving near the doorway. Another man, lean and jittery, gripping a baseball bat, shifting his weight like he was waiting for the right moment to swing. The girl's stepfather wasn't alone. Mason stepped out of the dark and said firmly, "Hey, let her go." The two men froze. For a brief second, time stalled. The stepfather squinted, trying to focus. "Who the hell are you?" he slurred. "Get out of my house." Mason took one slow step forward, his voice steady. "She's done nothing wrong. You're gonna untie her, and you're gonna walk away." The bat-wielding friend laughed, stepping closer. "Or what? You gonna preach us to death?" He swung without warning. Mason ducked, the bat grazing his shoulder. Pain shot through his arm, but his reflexes took over. Years of fights, of bad choices, of survival, all came flooding back. He slammed into the man, sending both crashing into the kitchen counter. Bottles shattered. The stepfather raised his gun, trembling. "Don't move!" Outside, one of the bikers shouted, "Cops are coming!" Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder. The girl's mother screamed through her gag. The little girl, still hidden behind the couch, covered her ears, rocking back and forth. Mason lunged toward the stepfather just as he pulled the trigger. The shot tore through the wall, missing by inches. Mason grabbed his arm, twisting until the gun clattered to the floor. Vince burst through the front, tackling the man with the bat, both tumbling into a heap of broken glass. The sirens grew closer now, flashing red and blue against the window. Mason untied the mother's wrists with shaking hands. "You're safe," he whispered, though even he didn't fully believe it yet. Her breathing came in gasps, each one filled with panic and disbelief. Outside, tires screeched. The other bikers yelled for Mason to hurry, but before he could move her, the girl's voice cut through the chaos. She screamed again, not for help, but for someone she recognized. The red and blue lights painted the desert sky like a broken promise. Sirens cut through the still night as the officers poured into the yard, guns drawn, voices echoing commands through the dry air. Mason stood back, his chest heaving, knuckles bruised, as the little girl clung to her mother. The stepfather lay face down on the dirt, handcuffed, muttering curses under his breath. For a moment it looked over. Relief hovered in the air, fragile, uncertain, until something shifted. One of the officers looked toward the end of the road as another vehicle pulled up fast, dust swirling behind its tires. Out stepped a man, tired eyes, disheveled clothes, a badge clipped to his belt. He ran straight toward the girl, shouting her name, voice trembling. "Emma! Emma!" The child froze. Then she whispered, "Uncle Ray?" and bolted toward him, arms outstretched. Mason watched as she buried her face into the man's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. The crowd went silent. Even the police stopped for a moment. Something wasn't adding up. The officer in charge turned to the man. "Sir, you can't be here. Who are you?" The man caught his breath, flashing an ID. "Raymond Harris. I'm her legal guardian. I've been looking for them for days." His words hit like a hammer. Mason glanced at the girl's mother, whose tear-streaked face now twisted with disbelief. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "You found us," she whispered. The truth unfolded in fragments, fast, raw, and heavy. The stepfather, it turned out, wasn't supposed to be anywhere near them. He had taken the mother and child 3 days earlier from a safe house where they'd been hiding. The uncle had filed a missing persons report, pleaded with local law enforcement, but no one had found a trace. Until tonight. As the officers led the stepfather toward a patrol car, Mason caught a glimpse of his face under the flashing lights. There was no panic, no shame, just a cold, knowing stare. A faint smirk crept across his lips, as if to say, "You stopped me tonight, but you didn't finish it." Mason held that stare, his jaw tightening. He'd seen that look before, in men who had done evil things and weren't finished doing them. Something deep inside him twisted, a voice whispering that this wasn't the end. A brief flashback flickered in his mind. The uncle sitting alone at a police station days earlier, voice shaking as he told the officer, He said he'd find them. No matter where I hid them, he said he'd find them. Another image, the mother clutching her daughter, whispering through tears, "Just a little longer, baby. We'll be safe soon." Mason blinked, the weight of it all pressing down. This wasn't a simple act of violence. It was a kidnapping, a story that had started long before he stepped into it. The little girl turned to Mason, her voice small but steady. "You found us," she said. Mason didn't answer. He just nodded, because part of him knew they weren't out of danger yet. As the police car drove off, the stepfather turned his head slightly, eyes locked on Mason through the window. A chill ran down Mason's spine. Something in those eyes didn't belong to a man defeated. It belonged to a man planning. The night grew quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence before another storm. The bikers looked to Mason, waiting for what came next. He didn't speak. He just watched the taillights fade into the distance, knowing deep down that this night wasn't closure. It was a warning. What the bikers didn't know was that this night was only the beginning. Morning came slow to Dry Creek. The sun rose over the desert like it always did, bright and merciless, but it couldn't burn away the chill left from the night before. The town seemed quieter now, as if it was ashamed of itself. The diner opened at 6 like clockwork. Same coffee, same cracked counter, same people. But the looks were different. Conversation stopped when Mason walked in. Forks paused mid-air. No one said a word. He took a seat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and stared out the window toward the highway. On the TV above the register, a news anchor recapped the night's events. Local biker group helps rescue missing woman and child. Suspect in custody. The waitress turned the volume down, her hands shaking slightly. Mason could feel the weight of the room pressing against him. Finally, he broke the silence. "You all knew," he said softly. "You heard them, didn't you?" No one answered. He turned toward them, eyes hard. "Where were you when she screamed?" The old man in the corner shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about not wanting trouble. A woman near the window wiped her hands on her apron and said, "We didn't know it was that bad." Mason's voice rose, steady but sharp. "You knew enough. You heard it, didn't you? A man yelling, a woman begging, a little girl crying down the road, and you all just sat here drinking your coffee." He stood up, tossing a few crumpled bills on the counter. The silence that followed was worse than denial. It was guilt, and everyone in that room felt it. Later that day, Mason stood outside the hospital, staring at the sky. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain. Inside, the mother lay unconscious but alive, her arms bruised, her body slowly healing. The doctors said she'd make it, though it would take time. The little girl, Emma, had been placed in temporary foster care, waiting for her uncle's paperwork to clear. Mason visited her in the children's wing. The hallways were quiet, lined with drawings taped to the walls, crayon suns, stick figures, hope in colors. He found her sitting by the window, legs swinging above the floor, the same torn teddy bear in her lap. She looked up when he entered, eyes tired but bright. "Hey there," he said softly. "How you holding up?" She didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Thank you." For a long moment Mason couldn't speak. He nodded, the lump in his throat too heavy to swallow. Her small hand reached out, resting on his scarred knuckles. That single touch, innocent, trusting, hit him harder than any fight he'd ever been in. As he left the room, the nurse smiled faintly. "She hasn't spoken to anyone all morning," she said. Mason just nodded because he understood. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. Driving out of town, he passed the diner again. Same cars, same people pretending not to see him. He pulled over on the edge of the highway, engine idling, the desert wind sweeping across the empty road. He thought about that little girl's voice, the cries he couldn't forget, and his own past, a boy who once screamed for help no one came to give. He realized he'd spent most of his life running from that sound. But this time, he'd stopped. He'd listened. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky gold and red, Mason lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "Not this time." He looked at the horizon, a hint of resolve burning behind his tired eyes. He wasn't ready to walk away, not this time. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of place where echoes carried stories too heavy to forget. Mason sat on the witness stand, hands folded, his voice calm but edged with truth as he told the jury what he saw that night: the girl's cry, the bruises, the gun, the fear. The defense tried to shake him, asking why he got involved, why a man like him cared. Mason just looked at them and said quietly, "Because someone had to." The room fell still. The mother sat in the back row, her face pale but steady, while Emma held her uncle's hand, eyes never leaving Mason. When the verdict came, it was swift, guilty on all counts: assault, kidnapping, unlawful possession of a firearm. The stepfather glared as they led him away, but Mason didn't look back. His focus was on the people who mattered, the ones who still had a chance to heal. Weeks later, under a sky washed clean by rain, Mason stood outside the courthouse steps, watching as Emma ran toward him. Her small feet slapped against the pavement, her laughter breaking through the gray morning. "You came back," she said, breathless. Mason crouched down, meeting her at eye level. In his hands he held a new teddy bear, clean, soft, stitched carefully where the old one had been torn. "Yeah, kid," he said, smiling faintly. "I came back." She threw her arms around his neck, and for the first time in years, Mason felt something shift inside, the weight of the past lifting, just enough to breathe again. As she ran back to her uncle, Mason watched them walk away, hand in hand, the kind of picture he'd never had but was grateful to see. The courthouse doors creaked shut behind him, the echo fading into silence. He took one last look at the road stretching beyond the town, knowing he could leave now, but maybe he didn't have to. Maybe staying wasn't weakness anymore. Maybe it was redemption. And as his voice lingered softly over the final image, the desert sun rising over Dry Creek, he said, "Sometimes the people who look the roughest have the softest hearts. And sometimes the loudest cry is answered by the one who's been silent the longest." Time moved on, as it always does, but Dry Creek would never be the same again. The mother recovered slowly, her strength returning, her laughter coming back in pieces. The uncle gained full custody, and Emma finally had a home where bedtime meant safety, not silence. Every now and then Mason visited, sometimes with the old biker crew, sometimes alone, always welcomed with a smile and a hug that said more than words ever could. Together they helped rebuild the old trailer, not to live in again, but to stand as a reminder of what had been survived. Fresh paint, new windows, a place no longer haunted by screams, but by resilience. The diner, once a quiet stop for passers-by, became something new. A meeting spot for the town, a place where people no longer looked away. There was a box by the door now, labeled "Voices Matter," where anyone could leave a note if they needed help. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mason sat in his usual booth, coffee in hand, watching as Emma ran in with her uncle, her new teddy bear clutched tight, her laughter echoing through the room. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from knowing that sometimes doing one good thing can change everything. The narrator's voice softened. She ran barefoot down a highway that morning, but what she found wasn't just help, it was hope, and in a world that often stays silent, one cry reminded us all that compassion is louder than fear. The music swelled gently beneath those words, a soft piano carrying the emotion into the air, fading into the sound of wind over the open road. And then a final pause, quiet, thoughtful, sincere. What would you have done if you heard that cry for help? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, Hit the like button and subscribe for more real stories of courage and hope.